Welcome to the program News from Poland, Business and Law, in an episode devoted to the topic of property regimes for international couples living in Poland. Such regimes affect the distribution of liability for debts, taxation, and the distribution of property after divorce and death. The subject will be discussed by Anna Olejniczak-Michalska, attorney at law, associate at Wardyński and Partners. After that, I will tell you about the situation on the Polish labor market after the arrival of refugees from Ukraine. We address our program to foreigners acting as board members in Polish companies, foreign investors in Poland, and their foreign advisors.
Hi. Polish law does not provide a special property regime for international couples. Also, although Poland is an EU member state, it does not apply EU rules on property regimes. Poland does not legally recognize same-sex marriages, nor does it provide for legal regulation on registered or unregistered partnerships. On the other hand, married couples can choose the way they will own their assets together. This is known as a matrimonial property regime. Each of these regimes will have resulting consequences in terms of liability, divorce, succession, and tax. There are several types of available matrimonial property regimes, 1 statutory and 4 contractual. Let's look at the general principles behind them, especially in terms of assets and liabilities. If the spouses do not opt by contract for any other kind of marriage regime to apply, then, by default, all the assets they acquire during their marriage, for example houses, plots of land, cars and shares in companies, will be deemed to be shared property. This is known as the statutory community of assets. Each spouse retains his or her own property acquired before the marriage. Several other assets are also excluded from the community of assets, for example, assets acquired by inheritance or donation, joint ownership in a civil law or commercial partnership, assets acquired in exchange for personal property, or copyrights and intellectual property rights. Spouses may extend or restrict the statutory community of assets. However, there are legal limitations on the spouse's discretion in this regard. The spouses may also establish a separation of assets or a separation of assets with equalization of accrued gains. In the separation of assets regime, all property owned before or after the marriage remains the property of each spouse. As this also applies to debts, this regime can protect one spouse from the other spouse's creditors in case of bankruptcy. Each spouse manages his or her assets as he or she sees fit. Separation of assets with equalization of accrued gains is a system which does not differ from the system of separation of assets for as long as it is in force. Only its termination leads to the obligation of division and equalization of assets. This regime assumes that spouses should benefit equally from the increase in their property during the marriage, even if they manage their assets individually during the marriage. Although rarely chosen by future spouses in Poland, this regime should be considered, for example, when one spouse runs a business and the other takes care of the children and creates conditions for the professionally active spouse to work. The contract must be drawn up in the form of a notarial deed. It may be concluded either before or during the marriage. The spouses may change the marriage contract at any time if the formal requirements are met. In Poland, there is no special register of marriage contracts. The National Court Register does, however, allow for the registration of information on the property regime of entrepreneurs or partners in companies. Why is it useful? The data in the register is public. The spouse may rely on the marriage contract if a third party was aware of the contract, for example, through a note on the property regime in the National Court Register. Family law also provides for a compulsory regime of separation of property in case of court-ordered separation of assets, court-ordered separation of spouses, incapacitation or bankruptcy of one of the spouses. Who manages the joint property? Can one spouse manage property alone, or is the consent of the other spouse necessary? What effect does the lack of consent have on the validity of the contract? Each spouse may individually benefit from the assets of the community property. The consent of the other spouse is required in several cases. For example, any legal transaction concerning the transfer, mortgage, or purchase of real estate. A contract concluded by one spouse without the required consent of the other spouse is invalid unless it is subsequently approved by the other spouse. A unilateral act, for example, donation by one spouse without the required consent of the other spouse, is simply null and void. During the marriage, both spouses are liable for debts incurred by either of them to meet the everyday needs of the family. If a spouse incurs a debt with the consent of the other spouse, the creditor may demand that the community property also be used to settle the debt. If, on the other hand, a spouse incurs the debt without the consent of the other spouse, the creditor may demand that the debt be settled only from the debtor's personal property. Spouses remain responsible for existing debts after divorce or separation. The division of community property does not include debts. Any agreement between the spouses on the repayment of debts will be ineffective toward creditors unless the creditor agrees to one spouse taking over the debt. If the execution against the limited liability company proves ineffective, the members of the management board are jointly and severally liable for its obligations. A debtor who is a board member is liable with all his personal assets. The law applicable to matrimonial property regimes determines how property is distributed in the event of divorce or separation. It is therefore important to choose it wisely before divorce is even considered. The spouses may choose the law applicable to their property regime. They may opt for the law of the country of nationality of either spouse or of the country in which at least one of them resided. The spouses may choose the applicable law either before entering the marriage or during the marriage. In the absence of any prior agreement on the applicable law, the statutory provisions of the Polish international private law will apply. This means that personal and property relations between the spouses are subject to the law of the country of which both spouses are nationals. If there is no common nationality between the spouses, the law of the country where both spouses have their place of residence will apply. If the spouses do not reside in the same country, the law of the country to which the spouses are most closely related applies. Thank you.
Before 24 February 2022, the day on which the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine, there were around 1 million economic migrants from Ukraine living in Poland, in addition to 38 million Polish citizens. And estimates indicated that the booming Polish economy, the sixth largest in the European Union, would easily absorb another 300,000 workers from Ukraine. The number of Ukrainian citizens living in Poland is currently 3.2 million. Of these, 2.2 million are people who arrived after the war broke out and are mainly women and children. The arrival of refugees from Ukraine has caused Poland's population to reach 41.5 million for the first time in its history. Already 102,000 Ukrainian citizens who arrived in Poland after Russia launched hostilities against their country have found legal employment. 75% of those employees are women. And now for a curious fact. It has been estimated that following Russia's attack on Ukraine, some 150,000 Ukrainian men left Poland to defend their country. Nevertheless, there has been no fall in the number of workers for whom social security contributions are being paid. It appears that Polish employers have not terminated the employment contracts with those workers. They have granted them unpaid leave and continue to pay contributions for them, hoping that their employees will return. All of this is indirectly supporting the war effort of Ukraine's defenders, who can continue with their fight, secure in the knowledge that in Poland their women and children are safe. Thank you for watching this episode. See you soon.